The third Sunday of Advent is traditionally known as Gaudete Sunday, Gaudete being the Latin for rejoice, take heart. And it's called that because in the pre-Vatican II days when Mass was in Latin, the opening words of the Mass on this Sunday were taken from Paul's letter to the Philippians in chapter 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice, the Lord is at hand. Those words actually appear often in the Psalms of the Old Testament, but what gives them an added poignancy for the Philippians is that Paul is writing those words from his prison cell in Rome, the Mamertine prison near to the Forum, which you can still visit today if you're ever in Rome. It's a dank, smelly, dark, underground chamber close to the Roman sewers, the equivalent of our modern death row. It was out of that awful situation that Paul was able to encourage the Philippians to rejoice. The Lord is at hand. And that is the key to our faith. And that's what we have to believe and hold on to, especially when we can see no way out of some difficult situation, when all appears bleak and black and we're tempted to think that there's no point in going on. We've nothing to live for. Over the 55 years or so of my active ministry as a priest, I came to realise that very few, if indeed anyone, goes jauntily through life without a care or a hitch to their plans. We might imagine at times that some people, like those who are very wealthy or very famous, or even people who live close to us and whose lives seem to be unruffled and untroubled, somehow or other we will look and wonder if they are more blessed than we are. But as the saying goes, you never know what's going on behind closed doors or below the surface. The Scottish poet Robert Burns had a knack for seeing through the protective fronts that people sometimes put up, the masks that all of us at times wear to prevent revealing the vulnerability of our human nature. And much of his poetry takes a satirical look at everyday commonplace social customs and traditions, the poses, the postures that go on in society, and he pokes fun at them and makes us take a closer look at our own lives and our own attempts to pull the wool over the eyes of people and sometimes to try and fool ourselves. His 1785 poem, To a Mouse, was occasioned by a day in the countryside when he saw a little harvest mouse scurrying to get out of the way of the farmer's plough, which had just destroyed its carefully planned and built nest. And this is what he wrote. But mousey, thou art no thy lane in improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft a gley, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Now I'll translate that for those of you who might not be familiar with the Scottish dialect and nearly tripped over the first line, as you noticed myself. But little mouse, you are not alone in proving foresight might be vain. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry and leave us only grief and pain instead of promised joy. You may recall from our reflection for the first Sunday of Advent this year how we all have our amens in life, the securities on which we try to build our lives and create safety and happiness for ourselves, but also for those we love and who depend on us. None of those amens come with a guarantee, and all of them will fail us at one time or another, and probably without notice, and we will find our world coming crashing down around us. We might suddenly lose our job. The family might be involved in an accident. There could be a burglary or a financial crisis, or we're struck down with a sudden fatal illness. The list of possibilities is endless. And it can be a daunting prospect to summon up enough energy and enthusiasm to start all over again. It's tempting just to lose heart, let yourself drift, lose interest in anyone or anything, and see yourself as one of life's losers. I'm reminded of that well-known remark attributed to the famous film icon Greta Garbo, "I want to be alone." In fact, she would correct that later in an interview for Vogue magazine, and she said, "What I actually said was, I want to be let alone. In other words, I don't want to be bothered or pestered or cajoled. Just leave me be." And I suspect that in our very mundane and down-to-earth lives, we might have felt if we didn't actually say those very same words, and maybe more than once in our lifetime. And it doesn't help when people around us, family and friends, tell us to snap out of it. Give yourself a shake. You've got to get over it, whatever it may be. It's not all that long ago since all of our lives were turned upside down suddenly, without warning, when the coronavirus struck globally, and all our plans and schemes went out the window. It was a harrowing time for many people who found themselves forcibly being left alone and let alone, and sometimes sadly let alone to die alone because of lockdown and its restrictions. And that pain is still there. And we were all in the same boat, unable to help ourselves. We needed and thankfully got the antidote that could counteract the debilitating effects of that virus. Now, that whole viral situation helps me to understand why we are summoned and invited to rejoice on this third Sunday of Advent. For we have all been living out our lives for a long time under the debilitating influence of the virus that we call sin. Now, I know sin is not a very fashionable word nowadays, even within the ranks of the faithful. It may be true that in the past we were a bit too quick to see sin everywhere in ourselves and in others. But whether we call it sin or not, there's enough evidence in the long story of human development and the struggle for progress to suggest that it's not forces from outside of ourselves, many and powerful though they have been, that have presented the greatest obstacles and challenges. No, it's been people themselves who have proved to be their own worst enemies by allowing that virus that is sin to dictate life, to dictate the whys and the whens and the wherefores of real constructive decisions that could make for progress. And that very same thing happens and is true, if we're honest, in our own personal life stories. Sin, like the COVID virus, was the result of human irresponsibility. It didn't just appear out of thin air. It was manufactured and introduced into the environment by us and spread by us. Sin is alien to the world that God wanted and that God originally planned. And it's foreign sin to our natural environment. But once we introduce it irresponsibly, it gets a foothold and it spreads like wildfire and continually works against our best interests and undermines our best efforts to work together and to care for one another and to build a safe home for the whole of humanity. Now, once again, the Scottish poet Robert Burns was quick to cotton on to that and to what really is going on within society. And in his satirical poem of 1786, entitled this time to a louse. Now remember, a louse is a little head bug. The plural is lice. Burns reflected on seeing a louse roaming around freely in the hair and bonnet of a lady sitting in front of him in church. She had no idea it was there. She would have been appalled at the very thought of it. Me having lice? No way. I'm reminded of those words, "Not I, Lord," as each of the disciples at the Last Supper dismissed the very possibility that one of them could be capable of betraying the Lord. No way. Well, anyway, Burns wrote this. "Oh, wad some power the gift to gie us, to see ourselves as others see us, it would frae mony a blunder free us and foolish notion." I nearly lost the Scottish accent myself. I'll translate that for you. "Oh, would some power give us the gift to see ourselves as others see us, it would free us from many a blunder and foolish notion." Facing the truth, or being made to face the truth about ourselves, is not always a pleasant experience. We know from our own past that sometimes we bristle, we become defensive when someone touches on a sore point, and we all have a sore point, maybe even more than one sore point. A sore point is an area of vulnerability that we don't want to be true about ourselves, that we don't want to admit to. It could be a prejudice, a bias. It could be the memory of a past hurt, of an abuse. It could be an inclination towards some behaviour that is inappropriate, unacceptable. It could be a forbidden love or an infatuation. It could be a temper, a fierce impatience. The list is endless. Whatever it is, we try to keep it in check, to ignore it, or worse still, to deny it. And so we end up saying, "You've got me all wrong. I'm not like that at all. It was a one-off. I was provoked." Shakespeare put his finger on it in Hamlet when he says of Queen Gertrude, when she was being accused of conspiring in the death of her husband, "Methinks she doth protest too much." We might have found ourselves saying that sometimes about somebody else, and we might have found somebody else sometimes saying that about us. When we refuse or fail to acknowledge that weak spot, that vulnerability, we then have to set about creating a new persona, a false persona, that we want to be the real me, that we want other people to think of as the real me. But really, only God can create the real me. He is that power in Burns's poem that not only would like to give, but actually does give us the gift to see the truth about ourselves and not despair, and to change or work with what we find in ourselves. The gift that frees us from making, as Burns put it, so many blunders, and from having false notions about our real selves. The gift is faith, and faith is the antidote to the virus that we call sin. Faith realigns us and our lives with God's all-embracing plan for us and for this world in which we live. Faith prompts us to stop gazing inwards and to start looking outwards, and to accept more responsibility for the well-being of the people around us and for the environment, and indeed for the well-being of the world itself. And we actually acknowledge that relationship and that responsibility between sin and faith every time we gather to celebrate the Eucharist and to ask the Lord to create a new me and a new us in communion with Him. As we prepare for the communion at the Mass, the Church prays, "Look not on our sins, but on the faith of your Church." Now, as a teacher, I used to look for little techniques, mnemonics, if you like, to help students remember things. And I did find one way of helping them remember how faith acts as an antidote to sin. So I'll share it with you. On one side of the board, I would write the word sin, and opposite the word faith. And under the word sin, I would write 4 words which begin with the letter I, the central letter of sin. Because I, me, that's the heart of sin, that's the problem. Me, what St. Thomas More referred to often as this troublesome thing that is me. That is the source of the trouble. Anyway, the 4 words describe the dynamics of sin, what sin causes, what it does. And the 4 I's, one leads to another. So the first is isolation. Sin cuts me off from others, even from God. All that matters is me and what I'm after. Secondly, insulation. Sin does what we all tend to do during the winter. We lag the pipes to keep the cold from getting through and the heat from getting out. So we cosset ourselves, we insulate ourselves from the cries and the needs of people around us, so as to keep ourselves comfortable and safe. And that leads, thirdly, to individualism. It's got to be my way or none. My word is final. And that leads to a fierce independence. Leave me alone, the Greta Garbo syndrome. I'm self-sufficient. I can do this by myself and for myself. Well, then, under the word faith on the opposite side, I write the 4 words that begin with the letter C, because the first letter of Christ is C. The 4 words describe the dynamic of faith, what faith actually does to counteract the 4 I's on the other side. So instead of isolate, faith makes contact. It gets us in touch with God and with others. And we need contact if we're going to become truly human. Under contact is communication, which works against the insulation. We let others get through to us. We hear their cries. That's the give and take of life. And that's the original rhythm envisaged in the book of Genesis. Under communications, the 3rd C, community, which works against that individualism. And community is described by Paul in chapter 4 of Ephesians beautifully. There is one body, one spirit, just as you were all called into one and the same hope when you were called, and each has been given his own share of grace, which means that there's a whole environment, context of grace. It's coming at me from all directions and from all sorts of unexpected people. And so the final I, interdependence, which works against that fierce independence. Interdependence, the give and take of community. And another word for interdependence is communion. And I don't mean simply communion in the sense of receiving communion as a private devotion. That is, of course, special. But of being invited into communion and wanting to be part of the mission with the Lord and others in doing good and spreading the good news. If you're at Mass today on the 3rd Sunday, you might see little signs that there's a change in the mood. The 3rd candle on the Advent wreath is rose-coloured. It's softer than the original purple. and the priest might be wearing rose-coloured vestments instead of the purple. Many years ago, a parishioner presented me with a personal gift of a homemade set of rose-coloured vestments, which I was delighted then to wear every year, once in Lent and once in Advent. And the parishioners coming to Mass would tease me and say, "Oh, I see Father's in the pink today." It did look a bit like pink, actually. But to be in the pink usually suggests that you're enjoying relatively good health and spirits. You're ready for action. You're up and raring to go, to get stuck in, to do something challenging and constructive, useful. Well, it's not just the priest who's expected to be in the pink today, but all of the faithful, all of you who enjoy the gift of faith. To have faith doesn't prevent us from still having to cope with the challenges and the difficulties of life, but it does help us to appreciate how infinitely more difficult it must be for people who do not have faith, who haven't heard the good news, or maybe who have heard it but have not experienced the reality which the words convey. There is little room for many people in our world and little reason for them to rejoice today. For them, the Lord does not seem to be at hand. That's our responsibility. Today, the Gospel reminds us of the part played by John the Baptist in the whole story of God wanting to come close and wanting to be in touch with the lives of every human being. We are called to play that same part. Sometimes when we look around us, the sheer scale of the human struggle for survival, never mind for safety and security, can overwhelm us. What could I do that possibly would make a difference? John thought the same. John knew he wasn't the light, he wasn't the Christ, he wasn't someone particularly important or special, but he was happy to do his bit, to be a witness, to prepare the ground, as it were, so that people would recognize and be ready to welcome Christ when he came in person. Our faith invites us to do the same, and to do it without drawing attention to ourselves, making a song and dance about it, just quietly and discreetly going out to people around us, not doing great things, but maybe small but welcome things for people. And remember, actions speak louder than words, and faith proves itself in action, in doing good. Jesus himself, in the Sermon on the Mount, in chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel, tells us, "Your left hand must not know what your right hand is doing, but I do expect you to be doing something." And in one of his sermons recently, Pope Francis urged us in the same way. The Christian life, he said, is not a navel-gazing one. It is a life in which one gets out of oneself in order to give oneself to others. Let me leave you with a story from my life as a priest, working with a group of undergraduates, university graduates. They were all Catholic, they were all students, they were all medical students. And they had organised themselves at the beginning of the new academic year into a small group and proudly produced and were wearing a small homemade badge which bore the letters P-A-T-A, PATA. It was designed precisely to get people asking, especially at the Freshers' Week, when all the new students are coming up to university for the first time, and during Fresher Week they see the vast array of possible groups and societies that they can join. And invariably they would stop at the stall of these students and say, "What does PATA mean?" And they would say, "Well, PATA means positive alternatives to abortion." Those youngsters were determined to show their opposition to abortion, and abortion does sadly happen during university years. And they wanted to show their opposition not simply with judgmental banners and words and public demonstrations. I discovered that from their meagre student resources and resourcefulness, they had gathered enough money to rent a flat in London, in Camden, and equip it for any students who found themselves facing the possibility of abortion and who felt that they had no other option than either to have an abortion or to go home and face the family. Pata offered a safe place with basic supplies, food and so on that a girl or couple perhaps would need to allow them an alternative while continuing their studies. I was in admiration of them. That was their faith in action, doing good, and it brought a joy to so many people. It made me recall what an old priest of my diocese once remarked to me. Thank God, he said, for the people of God. And when I think of that small Pata group, I thank God for the faith of the people of God. They continually surprised me and still do as a priest. And that is cause enough for rejoicing. Stay safe and God bless you.